It all began on a quiet, sunny afternoon in a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, the kind where every mailbox matched, every lawn was clipped to the exact same height, and every neighbor waved just long enough to be polite but never long enough to care. For months, everything seemed peaceful in Willow Creek Estates. The Homeowners Association prided itself on maintaining order, which was really just code for control. And for most people, that control was easy to ignore, until it came knocking on their door. For one homeowner, that knock came in the form of a white envelope with a bright red HOA seal stamped across the top. Inside was a letter that would change everything. It stated, in an almost smug tone, that her rescue dog, Buddy, a gentle 80-pound Labrador mix, violated community pet policy. According to the HOA's bylaws, no pet could exceed 75 pounds or be classified as a large breed. The letter didn't even bother to acknowledge that Buddy was a therapy animal or that he'd been living there peacefully for nearly 2 years. It was a command, not a request. Remove the dog within 14 days or face daily fines. The homeowner, let's call her Emily, was stunned. Buddy had been her companion through the hardest years of her life. He wasn't aggressive, didn't bark excessively, and was loved by every child in the cul-de-sac. Yet now, the HOA, led by a woman named Patricia, a self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, was threatening to take him away. Emily had heard stories about Patricia before. Everyone had. She was the type of HOA president who patrolled the streets with a clipboard and a measuring tape, always on the hunt for violations. Whether it was a slightly faded mailbox, a trash can left out too long, or a flag that wasn't regulation size, she noticed everything. And once she did, a letter would follow. At first, Emily tried to reason. She sent a polite email with Buddy's adoption papers, veterinary records, and even a letter from her doctor confirming his role as a therapy animal. But 2 days later, another notice arrived, this time accompanied by a $250 fine. The justification? Failure to comply with HOA pet policy. The letter went further, warning that if Buddy remained on the property after the 2-week deadline, legal action could be taken. That was when something inside Emily shifted. Until that point, she had done what most residents did, paid her dues, kept to herself, and tried to stay under the HOA's radar. But now, with her beloved dog being targeted, she started paying attention. She began reading the HOA handbook, the meeting minutes, and every update the board had posted in the last 5 years. What she found was a mess of inconsistencies and power plays. Rules had been added quietly, often approved by only a handful of board members. Pet restrictions, fence colors, parking limits, all of it was designed to give the board more control while stripping homeowners of their say. Emily realized this wasn't about her dog. It was about power. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules for the good of the community. It was enforcing them to keep everyone in line. When she attended her first board meeting to appeal the fine, she saw that power in action. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a space that felt more like a courtroom than a place for neighbors. Patricia sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal board members. They looked down at Emily as though she were already guilty. The discussion was short. The board cited Regulation 9B, the one about pet size limits, and dismissed every argument Emily made. When she tried to explain Buddy's therapy status, Patricia interrupted to remind her that emotional excuses didn't override HOA rules. The motion to uphold the fine passed unanimously. As Emily walked out of that room, the chatter of the other residents echoed behind her. Some whispered words of sympathy, but most stayed silent. No one wanted to cross the board. Everyone had seen what happened when someone tried. There were stories, rumors really, about homeowners fined into foreclosure, about yards being dug up for unauthorized modifications, about neighbors suddenly receiving violations after speaking out. But Emily wasn't like the others. The next morning, she started gathering information. She knocked on doors, talked to neighbors, and asked questions no one else dared to ask. How many people had been fined? For what reasons? Did anyone actually vote for these rule changes? Slowly, she began to uncover a pattern. Nearly every decision had been made by Patricia and her small circle of friends. Meetings were often held without proper notice. Financial records were vague. sometimes missing. And most importantly, the board hadn't faced an election in years. That discovery lit a fire in Emily's mind. If Patricia could bend the rules to keep her power, then maybe it was time someone else used those same rules to take it back. Emily learned that under the HOA bylaws, any homeowner could call for a special election if they gathered signatures from at least 20% of the community. It wouldn't be easy. Patricia had influence, and many residents feared retaliation. But Emily had something stronger: motivation. She printed flyers, created a petition, and started knocking on doors again. This time not to ask questions, but to take action. She spoke softly but confidently, explaining how the HOA had grown too controlling, how decisions were being made without transparency, and how homeowners deserved a voice again. Some were hesitant at first, afraid of getting involved. But others, worn down by years of petty fines and letters, began to listen. One by one, the signatures came in. People began to whisper, not in fear, but in hope. They'd had enough. Enough of the fines. Enough of the rules. Enough of Patricia. By the end of the second week, Emily had collected more than enough signatures to trigger the election. She submitted them to the HOA office with a formal request for a leadership vote. Patricia was furious. Within hours, another letter appeared on Emily's doorstep, this one accusing her of disrupting community order and warning of possible legal implications. But it didn't matter. The bylaws were clear. A special election had to be held. For the first time in years, the residents of Willow Creek Estates would get to choose who led them. And this time, someone was willing to stand up against the system. Someone who wasn't afraid of their threats or their fines. Someone who was fighting not just for herself, but for every resident who'd been bullied into silence. As Emily sat on her porch that evening, Buddy resting peacefully by her side, she watched Patricia drive by slowly, glaring from her spotless SUV. Emily didn't flinch. The battle had officially begun, and she was ready for it. The weeks following the announcement of the special election were unlike anything Willow Creek Estates had ever seen. A neighborhood that had once been silent and subdued suddenly buzzed with tension. Conversations that used to revolve around lawn care and property values now turned to politics, power, and a dog named Buddy. Word of the upcoming vote spread fast. Patricia and her loyal board members moved quickly, flooding residents with official notices reminding them of the HOA's outstanding achievements. Low crime, neat lawns, rising home values. Each letter ended with a warning that instability in leadership could threaten the community's reputation. It was a carefully coded message. Vote for anyone else and you'll regret it. But the neighborhood had already started to wake up. Emily, still very much the newcomer to politics, found herself thrust into the center of a storm. What began as a fight to save her dog had evolved into a full-on campaign. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA drama now joined her cause. They shared stories of unjust fines, shady financial charges, and rule changes passed without notice. It was as if the whole neighborhood had been waiting for someone to finally stand up and say, "Enough." Emily didn't have Patricia's resources or her connections. What she had was sincerity. She wasn't running to gain power. She was running to restore fairness. Her campaign began humbly. She made hand-drawn posters that read, "Take back our neighborhood," and placed them on community bulletin boards. She created a simple online group where residents could share concerns and ask questions without fear of being censored. And most importantly, she walked door to door, again. Every knock on a door was another chance to break through years of fear. Some residents opened cautiously, whispering that they didn't want Patricia to see them talking. But when Emily explained what the HOA had done, how it had ignored elections, violated transparency laws, and punished people for minor issues, their expressions changed. Many signed up to help. Some offered to print flyers. Others volunteered to speak at the next meeting. For the first time, neighbors who had barely known each other began to connect. Meanwhile, Patricia's reign began to show cracks. She responded to Emily's growing movement with hostility. Rumors started circulating. Claims that Emily was planning to dismantle the HOA entirely, that she wanted to remove pet restrictions so the community would be overrun by dangerous dogs. Her supporters, mostly longtime residents who enjoyed their influence, began policing the streets even harder. One man who had signed Emily's petition received a sudden violation notice for parking slightly over the sidewalk line. Another was fined for having a non-conforming flower pot color. Each of these acts only fueled the rebellion further. The residents saw the pattern clearly now. The HOA wasn't protecting them. It was punishing dissent. Then came the debate night BY bylaw. Each candidate for HOA president was required to present their platform at a public meeting before the election. Patricia entered the clubhouse like a queen returning to her court, wearing a crisp suit and the confident smile of someone who had never been challenged. Emily came dressed simply, wearing jeans and a cardigan, clutching a folder of notes she had rewritten a dozen times. The atmosphere was tense. Every seat was filled, and people even stood along the back wall. Patricia began the meeting with a rehearsed speech about preserving community values and keeping standards high. Her tone was polished, but the crowd's reaction was muted. They'd heard it all before. When it was Emily's turn, she stood behind the same podium, but she didn't read from her notes. Instead, she spoke from the heart. She told the story of Buddy, the dog who had brought her peace after a difficult chapter in her life. She explained how the HOA's rules had turned compassion into a crime, how neighbors had been fined into fear, and how the system that was supposed to serve them had instead enslaved them. She promised transparency, elections that mattered, and an end to selective enforcement. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just truth. And that truth resonated. By the end of her speech, the room was silent. Not in indifference, but in reflection. For the first time, Patricia looked uncertain. Over the next few days, the campaign escalated into open warfare. Patricia sent out glossy flyers claiming Emily was anti-HOA and unfit to manage community standards. She even hinted at legal troubles that didn't exist. But Emily's supporters countered with facts. They posted screenshots of missing budget reports, photos of unfair violations, and meeting notes showing how Patricia had extended her term without a vote. The election day finally arrived. The community clubhouse was transformed into a polling station, with volunteers from both sides checking names off the list. The air was thick with tension. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years now avoided eye contact, unsure who supported whom. Even Buddy, sitting quietly on the porch at home, seemed to sense the weight of it all. Votes trickled in slowly throughout the day. Patricia stood near the entrance, greeting her loyalists with forced charm. Emily stayed outside, walking her dog and waving at residents as they passed. She didn't beg for votes. She didn't make promises. She simply thanked people for showing up, for caring enough to have a voice again. When the polls closed that evening, the ballots were counted by a neutral committee. Residents gathered around the clubhouse, murmuring anxiously. Patricia stood near the front, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Emily waited in the back, heart pounding, trying not to imagine what would happen if she lost. After what felt like hours, the head of the committee cleared his throat and read the results aloud. For the first time in over a decade, Willow Creek Estates had a new HOA president. The margin was narrow, just 12 votes, but it was enough. Patricia's reign was over. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people cried, others hugged, and for the first time in years, it felt like the community had taken a breath of fresh air. Patricia, however, didn't clap. She left without a word, her heels echoing down the walkway like a threat. That night, Emily sat on her porch again, Buddy curled up beside her, the cool air carrying the faint sound of laughter from the clubhouse. The neighborhood lights glowed brighter than usual, as if the whole place had come alive again. But even as she smiled, Emily knew the battle wasn't over. Winning the election was only the beginning. She had inherited a broken system, and somewhere out there, Patricia was already planning her next move. Still, for the first time, Emily felt ready, not just to fight, but to lead. The morning after the election felt like the dawn of a new era in Willow Creek Estates. The air seemed lighter, the streets quieter, and the neighbors friendlier. For the first time in years, the community had something it had forgotten: hope. But as anyone who has ever tried to fix something broken knows, tearing down a corrupt system is one thing. Rebuilding it is another. When Emily officially took over as HOA president, she discovered just how deep the damage ran. The association's files were a disaster. Meeting minutes were missing or incomplete, financial records were confusing, and several official documents had no signatures at all. Some of the rules that residents had been fined for weren't even legally approved. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was a web of manipulation. The previous board had built a fortress of bureaucracy around themselves, making it nearly impossible for residents to challenge their authority. They controlled fines, architectural approvals, and even communication channels. Patricia, the former president, had practically turned the HOA into her own personal kingdom. Now, with her gone, the walls were finally down, but what lay behind them was chaos. Emily didn't panic. Instead, she began with transparency. Her first act as president was to hold an open meeting, one that every homeowner was invited to, no restrictions, no prior approvals. The community clubhouse, once a place of dread, was filled with energy and curiosity. People came early, brought their kids, even brought food. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a family gathering. Emily started by presenting the truth. She displayed the financial reports, the incomplete records, and the unauthorized rule changes. For the first time, residents saw how they had been misled. There was anger, yes, but there was also relief. The fear that had once kept them silent was gone. They weren't powerless anymore. Next came reform. Emily proposed a new set of bylaws, ones that focused on fairness, transparency, and community involvement. Every rule would require a community vote before approval. Fines would need documented proof and a grace period for resolution. Pet restrictions would be reviewed to allow for flexibility and compassion. And most importantly, elections would be mandatory every 2 years, with term limits for board members. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Residents cheered, volunteered to help, and shared ideas for improving the neighborhood. For the first time, people felt ownership of the place they called home. But not everyone was happy that in the shadows of this new beginning, Patricia watched from a distance. Though she no longer held power, she wasn't ready to disappear. Whispers began to spread again, claims that Emily's reforms would lower property values, that removing strict rules would turn the neighborhood into chaos. Anonymous letters started appearing in mailboxes, echoing the same rhetoric Patricia had used for years. Fear disguised as concern. Then one morning, Emily found a letter on her porch. It was unsigned, but she knew the tone immediately. It accused her of corrupting community standards, of using her dog as a political prop, and ended with a line that made her pause. "You may have won the vote, but this neighborhood will never belong to you." Emily smiled faintly. It was exactly what she expected. Bullies rarely go quietly. Instead of reacting, she doubled down on her efforts. She organized a community cleanup day, where residents painted fences, trimmed hedges, and repaired neglected playground equipment together. She encouraged homeowners to take pride in their properties, not out of fear of fines, but out of genuine care. Buddy, as always, trotted alongside her, wagging his tail as kids ran up to pet him. The neighborhood transformed. The lawns looked better than ever, not because someone demanded it, but because people finally cared again. The atmosphere shifted from control to cooperation. Even the most skeptical residents started to admit that life without constant HOA pressure felt better. Over time, Emily began to uncover more about Patricia's reign. There were questionable transactions. Money transferred between HOA accounts without clear explanation. Contractors hired without bids. Fines collected but never documented. Emily worked with an accountant and even a local attorney to audit everything. When the findings were complete, they were shocking. Thousands of dollars had gone unaccounted for. Emily didn't hide it. She presented the results publicly and announced that she would be filing an official complaint with county authorities. The room was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. Patricia's lingering influence shattered that night. Within weeks, investigators began quietly reviewing the HOA's old records. Patricia moved out of the neighborhood soon after, selling her house abruptly. No one knew whether she was avoiding legal trouble or simply couldn't stand watching the community thrive without her. Either way, her chapter in Willow Creek Estates had come to an end. Under Emily's leadership, The HOA evolved into something entirely new. Instead of fines and punishments, it offered assistance. Instead of letters of violation, it sent reminders and offers to help. Residents who had once hidden from board members now volunteered on committees, helped elderly neighbors with yard work, and hosted community events. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the election, the neighborhood gathered for a celebration. Food trucks lined the streets, kids played in the park, and Buddy, now the unofficial mascot of Willow Creek Estates, sat proudly beside Emily as she gave a short speech. She talked about how one act of unfairness had sparked a movement, how one dog's right to stay in his home had become a symbol of something greater, how change didn't begin with anger, but with courage, the courage to stand up, even when everyone else was silent. The crowd cheered as the sun dipped below the rooftops. Emily looked around at what the community had become. The same houses, the same lawns, but an entirely different spirit. People waved from porches, laughed freely, and treated each other like neighbors, not rule breakers. Buddy barked once, breaking her thoughts, tail wagging as if to remind her that all of this had started with him, with one simple act of defiance against a system that had forgotten compassion. She scratched behind his ear and smiled. Change, she realized, doesn't always start in boardrooms or ballots. Sometimes, it starts on your doorstep with a letter you refuse to obey. And in Willow Creek Estates, that single act had rewritten more than the HOA rulebook. It had rewritten what it meant to be a community.